Imagine you're at home, enjoying a quiet evening, when suddenly chaos erupts. Flashing lights, loud voices, and a battering ram at the door. This is exactly what happened to one man, a black homeowner who found himself at the center of an unwarranted police raid. Officers stormed into his house, searching for something they wouldn't find. What they didn't realize was that the man they were confronting wasn't just any homeowner. He was a retired general with decades of service to his country. As tensions rose, so did the stakes. Why did this happen? What led police to make such a grave mistake? And how did this retired general respond to being treated like a criminal in his own home? Stay with us as we unravel the shocking details of this story. A powerful reminder of how one wrong move can expose much deeper issues. It all started with a knock, or rather, the lack of one. The police didn't announce themselves before barging in, weapons drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. Neighbors peered out from their windows, confused and alarmed. Inside the house, the retired general stood frozen, his years of discipline barely holding back his disbelief. This was the home he had built with hard work, sacrifice, and service to his country. He had served in multiple combat zones, earning respect and recognition, but now none of that seemed to matter. The officers, moving with haste, didn't bother to explain why they were there. Every question from the general was dismissed. Papers, drawers, and closets were being searched without pause. Outside, more police vehicles arrived. The general's mind raced. Was this a mistake, or was something else at play? With each passing second, the line between confusion and outrage began to blur. As the raid unfolded, the retired general couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random mistake. He tried to piece it together. No warrant had been shown, no explanation given, just chaos and accusations in his own home. He glanced at the officers, scanning their faces for any sign of doubt or hesitation, but their focus was elsewhere. They overturned furniture, rifled through his belongings, and ignored his attempts to reason with them. Outside, a growing crowd of neighbors stood quietly, whispering to one another. Some recorded on their phones, while others looked uneasy, unsure of what was happening. Among them was a young man, a neighbor who often chatted with the general about his military career and his love for gardening. He watched with growing anger, questioning how someone so honorable could be treated like this. Back inside, the tension reached a boiling point. Then one officer uttered something that stopped the general cold, something that hinted at a bigger, more troubling misunderstanding. The officer's words echoed in the general's mind, sending a chill through him. "We got a tip about suspicious activity here." Suspicious activity? In his home, it made no sense. He demanded to know what exactly they were looking for, but his questions were brushed aside yet again. By now, the house was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, cabinets emptied, and family photographs knocked over. Despite his calm demeanor, a lifetime of discipline couldn't stop the anger bubbling inside him. He wasn't just defending his home. He was defending his name, his integrity, and his years of service. Outside, the neighbor with the phone moved closer to the officers gathered by the patrol cars. "What did he do?" the young man asked, his voice steady but laced with frustration. The officers didn't answer. Instead, one stepped inside the house, looking uneasy, as if realizing something wasn't adding up. Then it happened. The general, now standing tall despite the chaos, pulled out a framed certificate from his military service, one the officers had knocked off the wall. He held it up, his voice sharp but controlled. "This is who I am," he said, his words cutting through the noise. But even that moment of clarity wasn't enough to stop what was coming next. One of the officers stepped forward, handcuffs ready. The officer with the handcuffs hesitated, just for a moment, as the general's words and the certificate in his hand seemed to weigh on him. But protocol, or perhaps pride, pushed him forward. The general didn't resist as his wrists were restrained, though the fire in his eyes said everything. "You're making a mistake," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Outside, the murmurs of the growing crowd grew louder. Some shouted in protest, while others whispered questions. The young neighbor, still recording, called out, "Do you even know who he is? This man's a hero." Just as the officers began escorting the general out, one of them received a call on his radio. The tone shifted immediately. "What?" the officer said, turning away from the scene. His voice lowered, but the urgency was clear. He glanced at the general, his expression suddenly uneasy. Inside the house, another officer rifling through drawers came across a folder stamped with the Department of Defense seal. He froze, holding it up to his partner. They exchanged a glance before stepping back, as if realizing they were in over their heads. The officer with the radio rushed back into the house, his face pale. Something had gone horribly wrong, something that could turn this entire operation on its head. The house fell silent as the officer with the radio stepped inside, visibly shaken. "Stand down," he said abruptly, his voice tight with urgency. Confused looks passed between the other officers, but one by one, they began lowering their weapons. The general stood motionless, his hands still cuffed, watching as the chaos suddenly unraveled. The officer in charge approached him, clearly uneasy now. "Sir, there's been a mistake," he admitted, his tone no longer commanding but apologetic. "We received incorrect information." But the general wasn't satisfied. "A mistake," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "You stormed my house, humiliated me, and treated me like a criminal. And now it's a mistake." The weight of his words hung in the air. Just then, the officer holding the Department of Defense folder stepped forward, nervously extending it. "Sir, we didn't realize," he began, but the general cut him off. "You didn't realize because you didn't care to," the general said. "You didn't stop to question whether what you were doing was right." The officers looked at each other, clearly shaken by what they had just done. As the general was uncuffed and the officers scrambled to clean up their mess, the young neighbor outside shouted, "We saw everything." The crowd erupted in agreement, their phones still recording. The officers quickly retreated to their vehicles, trying to avoid further attention. But just as the tension seemed to settle, a final twist emerged. The general walked back inside, picking up the folder that had been dropped. As he opened it, a look of realization crossed his face. Inside were documents tied to a top-secret military operation, ones he thought were long buried. How had these surfaced now? And was this raid truly a mistake, or was someone looking for something much bigger? As the officers sped away, the general sat in his living room, the folder resting on his lap. The house was quiet now, but his mind raced. The documents inside weren't just a piece of his past. They were evidence of a mission he had once led, classified and buried for the safety of the nation. How they ended up here, after all these years, was a question that lingered like a storm cloud. Later that evening, the young neighbor stopped by, offering to help clean up. The general, though tired, smiled at the gesture. "Thank you," he said, "but some things need to be handled alone." Still, he reassured the young man that the video footage captured by the neighbors would ensure the truth of what had happened wouldn't disappear. As the night fell, the general locked the folder away, determined to uncover who had sent the police and why. For now, though, he sat back, reflecting on the strength it took to stand tall, even when his own home felt like a battlefield.